The patrol had been running clean for 6 hours when Dex heard it. Not through any instrument. Through nothing so reliable as instruments. Through the particular quality of silence that fills a ship's signals bay when all the electromagnetic frequencies are speaking at once in the same held breath, the way every musician knows the half-second before an orchestra falls apart, the way the silence itself becomes a sound, thick and wrong and full of intention. Dex pressed 2 fingers against the panel housing, not reading any readout, just feeling the faint vibration of the communications arrays cycling through their sweep. Half human, half Arath, born in the border settlements where the 2 species had tried and mostly failed to coexist, Dex had spent 23 years learning to translate the parts of themselves that couldn't be explained. The Arath side heard signal structure the way the human side heard melody. It was not a skill anyone had trained into them. It was simply what happened when 2 kinds of perception occupied the same nervous system. "Something's in the medium," Dex said. Ensign Pollard looked up from the main console. "Sir. In the electromagnetic medium. Something moving through it." Dex straightened and moved to the ship-to-ship channel, fingers finding the switch for the bridge intercom by feel. "Something large." On the bridge of the Meridian, Fleet Captain Mara was reading the maintenance logs from the Castor, the second oldest ship in the Third Fleet, which had been experiencing a recurring pressure variance in its port thruster assembly for the better part of a month. She was not, technically, the one who was supposed to be reviewing maintenance logs. That was the job of her engineering staff. But the Castor was Tomas Vega's ship, and Tomas had a habit of minimizing problems in his reports to avoid worrying the fleet, and Mara had known Tomas for 11 years, long enough to know that minor variance, within acceptable parameters, in his logs meant, "I'm looking at this every 4 hours and I haven't slept." The intercom clicked. "Captain." Dex's voice. Flat and careful in that particular way that meant they were translating something they didn't have words for. "I'm reading anomalous activity in the EM medium. Broad spectrum, low amplitude, extremely coherent. It's structured." Mara set down the maintenance logs. "How coherent?" "Captain, the structure is Arath." She was already moving. "Stations. All hands, battle stations. This is not a drill." Her voice into the ship-wide intercom, her hands simultaneously reaching for the fleetcom to raise the other 11 captains, because they needed to be told, needed 60 seconds of warning, 60 seconds to bring weapon systems live and sensor arrays to full. The pulse hit. There was no sound. No visible effect. No jolt or shudder through the hull. One moment every screen on the bridge was showing data. 12 ship positions, 14 active sensor feeds, long-range navigation, the route back to Fleet Station Ariadne, the daily dispatch from command, Tomas Vega's maintenance logs, and the next moment every screen was dark. Every screen. Not flickering. Not glitching. Dark. Lieutenant Commander Hassan looked up from a console that had gone the color of dead ash, and in his expression Mara read exactly what she already knew, not a power failure. Power failures had patterns, sequences, had individual systems go down in some order or another. This was simultaneous. Every system at once, as if every system had simply forgotten it existed. The bridge emergency lighting came on. Red. Dim. "Damage report," Mara said. No one answered immediately. Not because they were incapacitated, but because the damage report required functional systems to generate, and for 4 seconds every person on the bridge was pressing buttons and getting nothing, trying switches and getting nothing, staring at panels that had become expensive dark rectangles. "Navigation is down," said Lieutenant Osei, his voice admirably controlled. "Primary and backup." "Weapons targeting offline," said Ensign Chandra. "Communications offline," said Petty Officer Reyes. "All channels. Fleet comm, system comm, long range, all of it." "Life support." "Life support is analog-backed," said Hassan. "We have life support. Propulsion. Manual control only. No computer-assisted navigation." Mara stood at the center of the bridge and looked at the dark screens and the red lighting and the 11 faces turned toward her in the dim, waiting, and she thought, 30 years. That's how long it's been since anyone in this fleet had to fight without computers. 30 years since the manual systems were anything but emergency redundancy, tested once a year, never needed, never practiced with anything resembling seriousness. 30 years since any captain alive had navigated by star position without computer assistance. She thought, the Arath know this. They have known this. They have been waiting for exactly the moment we forgot how to fight without the tools they just took away. She thought, we have exactly as much time as it takes them to close the distance and begin the engagement. Where are my analog systems? She said. Hassan was already moving. Light signal panel. Here. Operational. Optical telescope. Manual. Operational. Emergency pressure barometer. He checked it. Operational. Clock. He looked at the ship's chronometer, which ran on a completely separate mechanical circuit. 14-12 hours, fleet standard. Good. Mara turned to the forward viewport. Through the viewport, at naked eye distance, she could count 7 ships of the Third Fleet. The other 5 were beyond visual range. All of them dark. All of them, in this moment, completely alone. Decks. Decks had come up from the signals bay. They stood at the back of the bridge, and Mara noticed that they looked, if anything, calmer than they had sounded on the intercom. As if the removal of all the electronics had taken away a kind of noise. I can still hear them, Dex said. The Arath. In the residual interference from the pulse. They're communicating. I can feel the structure even without equipment. Can you decode it? In time. I need to listen. Then listen, Mara said. I need everything you can give me. She turned back to the viewport and looked at the dark shapes of her ships hanging in space. All right. Here's what we're going to do. It had been Mara who insisted, 11 years ago, on the emergency signal protocols. She had been a commander then, the executive officer of the Fortuna, and the fleet had been going through one of its periodic mandatory review exercises where someone at command decided that all the old systems needed to be checked and logged and certified as functional. Most officers treated these reviews as bureaucratic exercises, rubber-stamping equipment that no one seriously believed would ever be needed. Mara had sat down with the signal officer of the Fortuna and spent 3 weeks developing an actual light signal code. Not just the standard emergency codes, which everyone knew in theory and which were limited to about 40 basic messages. Help, enemy contact, hold position. An actual working tactical language. Compressed. Efficient. Capable of conveying formation orders, targeting priorities, fuel states, casualty reports, timing sequences. She had then spent the next 3 months making every captain she served with learn it. Most of them had grumbled. Commander Tomas Vega had complained, with some justification, that they were wasting valuable training time on a system they would never use, because the communications equipment on modern ships was so redundant and so reliable that you would have to be dealing with something unprecedented to need light signals. Mara had said, yes, exactly, and made him learn it anyway. In the 11 years since, she had kept the code updated as she rose from commander to fleet captain. Every new officer who came to her fleet learned it. It had become a kind of unofficial tradition, one of the things that made the Third Fleet distinct. Mara's people knew the light code the way musicians know scales, not as something they needed to consciously perform but as something that lived in the hands. Now she stood at the light signal panel of the meridian and began to transmit. Long short long. Short long short. 3 pulse. 4 pulse. Short long. Long long short. All ships, this is Fleet Captain Mara. Acknowledge. The sequence took 9 seconds to transmit. She sent it twice. Then she waited, watching the viewport, watching the dark shapes of her ships, and she counted. 12 seconds after she finished transmitting, a light bloomed on the side of the castor. Long short. Short long long. Short short long. Castor acknowledges. Captain Vega. 20 seconds after that, 2 more lights. The Ariadne and the Thebes, transmitting simultaneously, their signals slightly overlapping in a way that was slightly illegible, which told Mara that whoever was operating the Thebes' signal panel was doing it from memory without looking up the codes, because Captain Huang always did everything from memory without looking anything up. The Ariadne acknowledges. Captain Solano. The Thebes acknowledges. Captain Huang. One by one, over the next 4 minutes, the other ships responded. 9 of the 11 visible ships acknowledged. 2 didn't. Mara stared at the dark shapes of the Kepler and the Praxis and felt something cold settle in her chest. They were beyond good visual range. Their signal panels might be functional. She might simply not be able to see them. She told herself this and noted it and set it aside, because there was no time to grieve for what might be lost. She began transmitting orders. The light code had no word for electromagnetic pulse, because no one had anticipated needing that specific word. Mara used the code for technical failure, complete combined with the code for hostile action and the code for enemy in vicinity, and she watched the acknowledgments come back, and she knew that every captain in her fleet had made the same calculation she had. The Arath were here, they had no computers, they had only this. Form Delta pattern, she transmitted. Delta was the defensive cluster formation. Ships within visual signaling distance of each other, overlapping weapons arcs, mutual visibility maintained at all times. She had drilled it theoretically. She had never drilled it on manual navigation by star position. She watched her ships begin, slowly, carefully, to move. Hassan had pulled out the stellar navigation charts, actual paper, because Mara had made him keep a physical copy of the regional charts in the bridge safe since she took command, and he and Osei were bent over them together, 2 voices and 4 hands working out position by the star patterns visible through the forward viewport and the side ports. "We're here," Hassan said, pointing to a spot on the chart. "Give or take 20,000 kilometers. That's a large give or take. Best we can do, Captain. Without GPS locks, we're working from stellar observation alone." "What's 20,000 kilometers at current engagement range?" Hassan exchanged a look with Osei. Osei said, carefully, "If they engage at long range, it matters. At close range, it doesn't. Then they'd better not engage us at long range." She turned back to the signal panel. The Castor was moving into position on her port side. The Ariadne had angled to take up station behind and to starboard. Slowly, painstakingly, using manual thruster control and naked eye estimation, the Third Fleet was doing something that hadn't been done in 30 years. It was forming up without computers, using visual cues and light signals and the accumulated experience of captains who had practiced together long enough to guess each other's positioning intent. What are they doing? Mara imagined the Arath commanders watching. Why are they still moving? Why haven't they scattered? Dex appeared at her elbow. "Captain, I've been listening to the residual EM interference, and I'm beginning to resolve the Arath communication patterns." "Tell me." "There." Dex paused, and in the pause Mara could see them translating across an interior gap, finding words for something that existed in their Arath-inherited perception as pure structure, as rhythm and shape and relationship, and only existed in human language as approximation. "They're confused. The communication patterns I'm reading show a lot of what I would call questioning. Repetition of signals. They expected something different to happen after the pulse. They expected us to scatter." "Yes." "Or to hold position and go dark. One or the other. What they're seeing is organized movement. And they don't understand it." Dex looked out the viewport at the lights of the Castor moving steadily into formation. "I don't think they have a category for this." "Good," Mara said. "Let's make sure they need one." She turned back to the signal panel and began transmitting the next order sequence. The order took 40 seconds to send, because it was complex. She was allocating firing arcs, assigning ships to specific defensive sectors, telling 3 of her captains to hold a reserve position behind the main formation that would allow rapid response in any direction. It was the kind of order that, on a functioning communication system, would have taken 3 seconds and been accompanied by visual diagrams on every bridge screen. 40 seconds, and she had to send it twice to make sure everyone received it. 40 seconds, she thought, was going to be the longest unit of time in her life for the foreseeable future. She looked out at her ships, arrayed in rough delta formation around her, moving into position with the careful slowness of people doing something precise without their usual tools, and she thought about what it meant to trust. Not the kind of trust that comes from confident calculation. Not the trust of certainty. The trust that exists between people who have served together long enough to know each other's habits, read each other's hesitations, anticipate each other's judgments. Tomas Vega, on the Castor, had served with her for 11 years. She knew exactly how much space he would leave between his ship and hers, slightly more than regulation, because Tomas was cautious in close formation, always had been. She knew that Captain Solano on the Ariadne would hold position perfectly but would initiate action half a second later than anyone else, because Solano's instinct was to make absolutely sure before committing. She knew that Captain Huang on the Thebes would be 30 seconds ahead of the order at every step, because Huang always knew what was coming. The Arath didn't know any of this. The Arath didn't know that this fleet was not 12 separate ships trying to coordinate across an equipment failure. This fleet was something else. Something that the Pulse had tried to break and had only stripped down to its actual structure, the way fire strips a piece of wood to its grain. "Hold Delta," she signaled. "Wait for my mark." Around her, 12 ships held. The Arath came in from the stellar north at 1,437 hours. Mara saw them through the optical telescope, Osei at the eyepiece, calling positions and vectors, his voice steady and precise, while Mara worked the signal panel and Hassan updated the paper chart with marks that would have been displayed automatically on 5 different screens 30 minutes ago. 7 Arath vessels, moving in their characteristic inverted V formation, the pattern that allowed their weapons arrays to maintain overlapping coverage while keeping their most vulnerable hull sections oriented away from the enemy. 7 against 12 seemed like good odds until you remembered that the 12 had no targeting computers. "They're holding the inverted V," Osei said. "Standard Arath attack approach." Dex. Dex was in the corner of the bridge, standing absolutely still, eyes closed, head slightly tilted. Not listening with ears, the EM interference from the dead systems wasn't audible. Listening with whatever it was in their Arath-inherited neurology that perceived electromagnetic structure as something like music. "They're instructing their lead ships to target our flagship," Dex said. "They're trying to locate you specifically." A pause. "They think if they take out the command ship, the rest will scatter." "Tell me something they don't know," Mara said, and turned back to the signal panel. The sequence she transmitted took 23 seconds. It told Captain Vega on the Castor to brake left. It told Captain Huang on the Thebes to accelerate forward and low, drawing fire. It told 3 other ships to hold position exactly. It told the last 6 ships to prepare for a wide arc rotation on her mark. The third fleet began to move. From the outside, Mara knew, it would look slow. It would look laborious. Each ship moving on manual thruster control, pilots estimating distance and velocity without instruments, captains watching the light signals and their neighboring ships simultaneously, every maneuver taking 3 times as long as it should. From the outside, it would look like a fleet in serious trouble. From the inside, it was the most precise thing Mara had ever seen her fleet do. Because without computers there was no automation, and without automation there was nothing happening that wasn't a human decision. Every thruster burn was chosen by a human hand responding to what a human eye saw and what a human mind assessed. Every position adjustment was judgment, experience, the accumulated weight of 11 years of working together, and it was, because of that, more perfectly calibrated to the specific situation than any computer could have made it, because computers optimized for the general case, and there was no general case. There was only this specific formation on this specific day, this specific fleet of people who knew each other. The Arath lead ship fired. The energy burst was visible through the viewport, a coherent packet of directed radiation that the Arath weapon systems excelled at generating, designed to penetrate human ship shielding, designed to be targeted by the very computers the Pulse had just destroyed. It missed the meridian by, Osei estimated, 1,000 kilometers. "They're used to targeting against our system outputs," Hassan said, reading Mara's expression correctly. "They're calibrated against the sensor signatures of our active computer systems. And we don't have active computer systems. We don't have active computer systems." Mara almost smiled. "Tell me that again in 30 minutes. She sent the mark signal. Meridian rotating. She felt it through the deck, the lateral thrust of the ship's turn, the kind of sensation she'd forgotten she could feel because for years the ship's computer managed its own inertia and the deck barely moved. Now she could feel it turning. Around her, visible through the viewport, the Castor and the Ariadne and the Thebes and 9 other ships were responding to signals she had sent 30 seconds ago, moving in a pattern she had designed for this specific Arath formation, the inverted V, the formation she had studied for years and thought about for years and had opinions about that she had never quite found a tactical situation to test. The inverted V had a center weakness. The lead ship was always slightly more exposed than the wings, because the formation was optimized for wing fire coverage and the center was expected to be protected by speed. Against a computer-guided fleet, the center ship never held still long enough to be caught. Against a fleet fighting on manual control, the assumption was that the center was equally safe, because manual control was slower and less precise. The assumption had not accounted for 12 captains who knew exactly where each other would be. The Thebes came in low and forward at a velocity that looked, from outside, like an undisciplined rush, the kind of panicked attack of a ship whose captain had lost their nerve. The Arath wing ships adjusted their coverage toward it, as Mara had calculated they would, because the Thebes was projecting exactly the signature of a ship whose captain was making an emotional rather than tactical decision, a ship breaking formation under pressure, an easy target. Huang was not making an emotional decision. Huang was making exactly the decision Mara had transmitted, executed with the precision of someone who had run this scenario in their head 12 times as the signal came in. The Thebes broke left at the last possible moment, a violent, computer-unsupported thruster burn that Mara felt sure was rattling every loose item on Huang's bridge, and opened a firing solution on the Arath center ship at 200 kilometers range. Without a targeting computer, Huang fired on a manually calculated solution, using astronomical triangulation and dead reckoning velocity, the kind of navigation technique that had been obsolete for 30 years. The shot connected. Not a fatal strike, the Arath shields took it and the center ship was intact. But the Arath formation broke, fractionally, in the half-second of their response. And in that half-second, Mara transmitted 3 short pulses and a long, and around her the Third Fleet rotated into the firing position she had set up while the Arath were watching the Thebes. Hassan said, very quietly, "That's beautiful." "Don't celebrate," Mara said. "They're adapting." They were adapting. Through the telescope, HSY was reporting changes in the Arath formation, the inverted V compressing, the wing ships pulling in, the center ship dropping back. A more defensive configuration. They were not running. They were reassessing. "They're signaling to each other," Dex said. "A lot of signaling. There's a pause. There's something in the frequency pattern I've never heard before. A specific structure that I think indicates confusion in their command chain. They're not agreeing with each other. What are they disagreeing about?" Dex was quiet for a moment. "Whether we actually know what we're doing." Mara looked out at her fleet. The Castor holding its assigned position with the precision of a ship whose captain had been drilling on manual navigation for the past 6 months because his fleet captain had told him to. The Ariadne, slightly off position, Solano's characteristic half-second delay, but close enough. The Thebes, recovering from its violent break, thrusters visible in the dark, coming back around to its assigned sector. "Tell them yes," Mara said. "We do." She went back to the signal panel. The next 47 minutes were the closest thing to silence that Mara had ever experienced in a combat engagement. Not silence in the sense of stillness. The ship was full of noise, the manual system cycling, the pressure of maneuvering thrust through the hull, the voices of Hassan and HSY and Reyes conducting the constant, exhausting work of running a ship by hand. But the kind of noise she was accustomed to in combat, the constant flow of computer-generated data, alerts, targeting solutions, enemy profiles, fleet positioning overlays, the sheer volume of information that a modern warship generated and processed and fed to its captain, was absent. In its absence, she noticed that she could think. Not that she had ever been unable to think in combat. But there was a difference between thinking through a data stream and thinking in open space, the way a musician who has always had accompaniment thinks differently when they're finally playing alone. The silence was clarifying. Every decision was just the decision, unmediated by recommendations and probability assessments and automatically generated tactical options. Just her, and the telescope, and the signal panel, and Dex. Dex was the center of everything now. "Second ship in the Arath right wing," Dex said. "They're preparing a flanking move. The signal structure is," they paused, searching for language. "It's like a held chord. Building. They're about to break out of the current formation. Direction. Above the plane. They're going to try to get altitude on us." Mara thought for 3 seconds, looking at Hassan's paper chart with its penciled fleet positions. "Which of our ships is currently positioned to respond to altitude?" "The Meridian, if we rotate. And the Sagan, she's already slightly high." She looked at the signal panel. Thought about the code sequence she needed. Composed it mentally before she began transmitting, the way a pianist thinks through a passage before playing it, because she couldn't afford to stop halfway through and correct herself. Confusion in her signals could be more dangerous than no signals at all. 28 seconds to transmit the Sagan's orders. 14 seconds for the Sagan's acknowledgement. "Right wing ship is moving," HSY said. "Breaking formation, going high." "How long until they're in a firing position?" "At their current acceleration, 2 minutes, 40 seconds. The Sagan had 2 minutes and 20 seconds to reposition. Without computers, 2 minutes and 20 seconds was not much. Without computers, a ship repositioned like a ship repositioned, manually, with human judgment, without the instant kinematic calculations that would normally make it simple. Captain Diaz on the Sagan was a good captain, competent and experienced, but Mara had sometimes thought that Diaz was slightly over-reliant on her tactical displays, slightly less comfortable than some of the others when she had to improvise. Mara transmitted a second sequence. Not different orders, the same orders, prefaced with the code for urgency. The code that said, "I am not repeating this because you didn't understand, I am repeating this because the timing is critical." A different kind of acknowledgement came back from the Sagan. Not the standard signal. The standard signal was 2 short pulses, acknowledgement. What came back was 2 short pulses followed by 1 long one, the code they had collectively evolved over years for. Something that had no official designation in the protocol. Understood. I know what you need. I've got it. Mara felt something release in her chest. Left flank ships are increasing drive output, Osei said. The Arath are trying to envelope. Give me direction. They want to bracket us, get ships at our 4 o'clock and 8 o'clock simultaneously. Standard encirclement approach. How long? 4 minutes for the 4 o'clock. 6 for the 8. Dex. Confirming, Dex said. They had been maintaining a running commentary on Arath signals, delivered in the same careful translating across a gap voice, each observation prefaced by a half-second pause as they found words. The left flank ships are, they're running a specific sequence that I associate with target acquisition. They're trying to lock us. Can they lock without computers? Dex was quiet for a long moment. Yes, they can. The Arath targeting systems have always had a manual backup mode. They haven't used it in 40 years, but they have it. A pause. We're not the only ones who forgot things. But they're remembering. Then we don't give them 4 minutes. Mara turned to the signal panel. The sequence she composed now was the most complex she had transmitted in the engagement. She was reorganizing the entire fleet formation, breaking the delta, spreading 2 ships out as screening elements, pulling 3 ships into a tighter core, releasing the ships she'd held in reserve into active maneuvering positions. It was the kind of order that would normally be accompanied by a visual diagram, because the geometry of it was not straightforward. She didn't have a visual diagram. She had the code. It took 63 seconds to transmit the complete sequence. She sent it 3 times to the ships in the periphery and twice to the core ships, because the peripheral ships were harder to signal clearly. Then she waited. The acknowledgements came back in the correct sequence, in the correct order, each captain using the correct code abbreviations to confirm they had understood. She knew the signal touch of every captain in her fleet by now. Vega's slightly hesitant 2-beat, Huang's rapid-fire certainty, Solano's meticulous spacing. They were as distinct as voices. The Third Fleet began to restructure. It looked chaotic from outside, she was sure. Ships breaking from the formation without visible pattern, thrusters firing in directions that didn't make immediate sense, the clean geometry of the delta dissolving into apparent disorder. The Arath would see disintegration. They would see a fleet that had been holding together through sheer will finally beginning to fragment under the sustained pressure of the engagement. They're adjusting, Dex said. The Arath signal patterns just shifted. They think we're breaking up. They're redirecting the encirclement ships toward what they perceive as the weakest point. The weakest point was the Ariadne. The Ariadne was where Mara had put it. Solano knows what's coming, Mara said. Not a question. Hassan said, You told him. I told him to expect pressure on his position. I told him to take it, hold it, and not to run. She watched the viewport. The Ariadne was exactly where she had told it to be, and it was not moving, and she knew that Solano was sitting on his bridge watching the Arath ships come toward him with a particular kind of discipline that was not fearlessness but something more functional than fearlessness, the knowledge that this was the plan and the plan was good and there was someone who had thought it through. The Arath left flank ships committed to the Ariadne, and as they committed, they exposed their own left flank. The ships that had been covering them swung away to support the encirclement, and in the gap that opened, the Castor and the Sagan and 3 ships from the restructured core were already in position. Because Mara had told them to be there 45 seconds ago. Fire, she said to Hassan, meaning her own ship's weapons, and simultaneously transmitted the fire signal to the 3 core ships. The engagement was not clean and it was not elegant. Two of her ships fired solutions that were clearly off-angle, manually calculated and imprecise, burning through empty space. The castor struck one of the Arath ships solidly on the port hull, and Mara heard Hassan exhale. The Meridian's own shot caught the edge of another Arath ship's shield and scattered. But the Arath formation was broken. The left flank ships that had committed to the Ariadne were out of position, their support was out of position, and the Third Fleet, which was supposed to be a scattered and disorganized herd of blind ships stumbling through their own destruction, was occupying exactly the tactical space it was supposed to be occupying. "They're signaling," Dex said. There was something different in their voice. All ships signaling simultaneously. A pause longer than usual. "I've never heard this pattern before. In Arath signal structure there's a frequency relationship that I associate with. They don't have a word for retreat in the conventional sense. The concept is closer to relinquishment. When they determine that a situation doesn't match any viable model." Dex's voice was careful and steady. "They are deciding that this situation doesn't match any viable model." Mara stood very still. "They're not retreating because they're losing," she said. "No. They're relinquishing because—" Dex searched for words. "Because we are something they don't have a word for." The Arath fleet withdrew at 1,531 hours. It did not flee. The distinction mattered, and Mara noted it carefully in the log she was composing by hand in the bridge notebook, because the post-engagement analysis would need to understand what had happened here, and what had happened was not a battle that had been won by force, but a battle that had ended because one side had encountered something that didn't fit any framework they'd prepared for. They came in expecting to destroy a blind fleet. They found a fleet that could see. Not well. Not with the speed and precision of its functional instruments. But it could see, through the optical telescope and the stellar charts and the light signal panel, through 47 minutes of complex tactical maneuvering conducted entirely in flashes of light and the accumulated judgment of people who had practiced together until practice became reflex. Mara stood at the viewport and watched the last Arath vessel's drive signature diminish and disappear into the dark, and she thought that she had never been more tired in her life. The exhaustion was not physical, though her hands ached from the signal panel and her eyes from staring at the telescope and the viewport. It was the exhaustion of sustained, unrelenting attention. 47 minutes of thinking without the assistance of any system that could think for her, 47 minutes of being the only processor, the only navigation system, the only tactical computer. Around her, her bridge crew was doing the same kind of quiet sitting that people did after a long, difficult crossing. Not celebrating, not debriefing, just existing for a moment in the fact of having come through. Hassan was marking the paper chart. Osei was writing the position log by hand. Reyes was running diagnostics on the communication system, partial diagnostics, because the system was still down, but the pulse had been optimized to wipe data and disable software, not to destroy hardware, and it was possible that some components could be manually restarted. Dex sat on the floor of the bridge, had simply sat down at some point without anyone remarking on it, with their back against the navigation console, eyes closed, not listening anymore. The Arath signals had faded with the fleet. For the first time in 90 minutes, the EM medium was quiet. "Casualties?" Mara asked. Hassan looked at his notes. "No confirmed dead. 2 ships reporting hull damage. The Praxis caught an edge hit. The Ariadne has some scoring on her forward section. No fatalities reported through light signal." He paused. "The Kepler and the Praxis have been out of signal range for most of the engagement. We won't have a full picture until we can close the distance." "We'll close the distance. Start the navigation calculations for repositioning to bring us into visual range of all ships." "By star position. By star position." Hassan and Osei went back to the chart. Mara turned back to the viewport and looked at the lights of her fleet, scattered and battered, and some of them surely worse than they'd reported, because captains always underreported to the fleet commander in the immediate aftermath. It was an instinct they all had, the instinct to project capability even at the moment of exhaustion. She heard Reyes's voice behind her. "Captain." She turned. Reyes was bent over the communications console, hands inside the housing, working by touch. The console was still dark, but there was a faint change in the quality of the darkness. Not illuminated, but alive in some way, a faint hum where before there had been nothing. "Partial restart," Reyes said. "I've got something. Short range only. Very limited. But it might be enough for voice." "Try it." Reyes adjusted something by hand. The hum increased, then steadied. Then, faint and static-laden and beautiful, a voice. Reading anything? Meridian, this is Castor. If you're receiving, please respond. Meridian, Castor, please. Mara crossed the bridge in 3 steps and took the comm manually, because the transmit function was working and she was not going to wait for anyone else to do it. Castor, this is Meridian. We're here. A sound on the other end that was not quite a word. Captain. Tomas Vega's voice. 11 years of knowing his voice, and she could hear in it exactly what 47 minutes of fighting blind would do to a person. You're there. We're here. We've been watching for your signals. The whole time. We had to keep repositioning to keep you in sight for the signals, and it was a brief silence. The crew knew. Every time your signal came through, I'd read it out loud, and everyone, they just kept going. Mara looked at the signal panel. The light panel, its switches worn smooth from decades of disuse followed by 90 minutes of constant operation, the switch that had been the only instrument keeping 12 ships from becoming 12 separate disasters. Captain Mara. Vega's voice, carefully controlled. Were those your signals? She looked at the panel. She looked at her hands. She thought about 11 years of practice drills and skeptical looks and 3 weeks of developing a code that no one thought would ever matter. They were, she said. A pause. Not the pause of silence, but the pause of someone absorbing something too large to absorb quickly. She could hear the background sounds of the Castor's bridge, the same emergency lighting hum, the manual system cycling, the particular collective exhale of a crew that had been holding their breath. Thought so. Vega's voice, steady now. Warm. The voice of someone who had been waiting a very long time to hear an answer they already knew. Good to hear your voice. Mara stood for a moment in the dim red light of her bridge, with her hands still resting on the signal panel and the faint crackle of static on the comm and the lights of her fleet visible through the viewport, each ship holding position, each ship whose captain knew what the others were doing because she had told them, in flashes of light, everything they needed to know. Around her, the bridge crew was quiet. Osei had stopped writing. Hassan had looked up from the chart. Even Dex had opened their eyes, and was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. The Arath half of their face was sometimes difficult for her to interpret, the slight elongation of the features, the slightly different way emotion moved through them, but she thought it was something close to what she felt. Not triumph. Something quieter than triumph. Something that had to do with having needed something that existed and finding that it did, in fact, exist, the particular specific relief of that. All right, she said. Her voice was steady. It had been steady for 90 minutes and it would stay steady now, because the work wasn't done. There were ships to reposition, damage to assess, a report to compose for command that would need to explain, carefully and completely, what the Third Fleet had encountered and how they had responded and what it meant for every other fleet that was out there right now running patrols with full computer systems and no memory of how to fight without them. There was work. But first, one moment. One moment of this, the static on the comm and the lights of her ships and Vega's voice still warm in the air, and the signal panel under her hands with its smooth-worn switches. Navigation, she said. Get me a heading for the Kepler and the Praxis. We're going to close the formation. Osei bent back to the chart. Mara went back to the signal panel and began to transmit. Third Human Fleet, after action notation, Fleet Captain M. Mara, composing by hand, Fleet Standard date March 17th, 12, submitted to Command Fleet Operations under separate courier. The electromagnetic pulse device used by the Arath in this engagement is a tactical tool designed around a specific assumption, that without computer systems, a human fleet is a collection of independent units without coordination capacity. This assumption is correct for any fleet that has not specifically maintained non-digital coordination capability. The Third Fleet maintained that capability. I recommend that all human fleets be required to develop and maintain equivalent systems as a matter of immediate priority. Secondary observation, submitted for the record. The Arath withdrew not because they were defeated in the conventional sense, but because they encountered something their tactical models did not contain. They had no category for a fleet that coordinated without electronics. I believe the lesson they will draw from this engagement will shape their next tactical development. The lesson we should draw from this engagement is simpler. Technology serves us until it doesn't. What we are without our technology is what we have always been. We should not allow ourselves to forget. Appended, complete light signal code and protocol documentation for distribution to all fleet captains. End notation.